Okay, so we'll make a start. Is that okay? Is all the tech fine? Mazayan and Jayanthi, who are going to help us?
Yes.
Everything ready to go. All right. So let me begin by welcoming all of you to this webinar on methodologies of measuring women's unpaid labor. And we will be looking at that issue by using the Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool for research on conflict-affected areas, in particular, Myanmar and Sri Lanka. So what I'll do is very briefly introduce us, the organizers. I'm Shirin Rai. I am the director of the Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Center for International Development. And together with the Monash GPS, Gender, Peace and Security Center, led by my colleague and collaborator, Jacqui, who sadly is not very well. So she's joining us, but she's not joining us, if you know what I mean. We are really very excited about sort of, welcoming you and having this program today. So I'll introduce our panelists. It's a brilliant panel of people presenting on Myanmar and on Sri Lanka. And then discussants who will discuss our this tool as well as the presentations, obviously. And then we will open it up to questions. As always, I'm sure there'll be lots. And then close hopefully in an hour and a half's time. So let's begin. One final thing to say, I suppose, before I give you a little introduction as well of what this tool is about, which was developed by Jacqui and myself, and actually used by the people who will be presenting today. And I'm really excited to hear what they have to say on that. So before I do that, I've also been told that if you want to tweet about this event, which we really hope that you would use the Twitter handle @WickedWarwick, all one word, I should think, yeah? So let's begin. First, I think, let me just introduce you to the panel today. The first person to introduce, and who's also really important to this webinar going smoothly, is Jayanthi Lingham, Dr. Jayanthi Lingham, who is the postdoctoral research fellow at the center WICKED, Warwick Interdisciplinary Center for International Development. Jayanthi's research interests are in feminist and critical historical approaches to the political economy of development, violence and conflict, especially in South Asia and particularly in Sri Lanka and Latin America as well. She's especially interested in the ways that dispossession and structural violence connect to and manifest in the everyday, on research at the intersection of conflict and development and social reproduction. Her PhD at SOAS was completed in 2019, and it examined women's working lives in the post-war context of Sri Lanka's northern province, Jaffna. I'm also delighted to introduce Ms. Anushani Alagaraja at the Adelayam Center for Policy Research, Jaffna, Sri Lanka, where she is co-director. Anushani is also working for a nonprofit research think tank, Center for Policy Research, that works on public policy issues in Sri Lanka with special focus on issues affecting Tamil polity on the island. Adelayam is based in Jaffna and works across the Northeast. Anushani is an activist and researcher who works in the field of gender rights, development, and human rights. In Sri Lanka, she was formerly coordinator for the Women's Action Network and has worked for the International Center for Ethnic Studies and Point Pedro Institute for Development. She also worked for the Domestic Violence Action Center in Hawaii. We then have Dr. Melissa Johnston, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Monash GPS. Melissa is a specialist in two areas of research. One is the pivotal role of misogyny and violence against women in contemporary violent extremism, populism, and right-wing politics. And second, the political economy of post-conflict rebuilding. Her doctoral dissertation was the winner of the 2019 Australian Political Studies Association Thesis Prize. And it applies a feminist political economy approach to the account of uneven outcomes of gender programming by international development agencies. Melissa has previously worked for UNIDO and Women Against Violence Europe. I'm also delighted to introduce Ms. Kong Yang. Kong Yang is a researcher at the Kachin Research Center, a nonprofit research organization headquartered at Mitayina, Kachin State. KRC works to promote social science research, engage in critical conversations about Kachin society, and build a comprehensive data bank of Kachin land. Kong Yang, her own research interests relate to the history of Kachin society and Kachin state. And in addition to her work with KRC, she's now studying for a history degree at the University of Maitingina and works as an English teacher in a church. Then we have our three discussants who I'm sure will provide robust and supportive responses to the presentations by Jayanthi and Anushani first, and then Melissa and Kong Yang second. So our first discussant is Ms. Nina Potarska, who is the Ukraine National Coordinator for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. WILF, as we know it, is an international nonprofit, non-governmental peace organization established in 1915 and today with national sections in 37 countries. Its mission is to prevent and end war through the analysis of its root causes, ensure that women are represented at all levels in peace-building processes, defend the human rights of women and men, and promote social and economic and political justice. Ms. Ratna Sudarshan is the trustee and former director of Institute of Social Studies Trust in New Delhi, India. ISST is a non-profit, non-governmental organization dedicated to conducting research and action programs to promote social justice and equity for the underprivileged with a focus on women. ISST believes that academic research can provide valuable inputs into grassroots activism and policy debate, but equally that activist experience and policy concerns need to influence the directions of research. And Ratna's own work in this area is fantastic, and I would recommend that you look it up. Dr. Samanthi Gunawardana is a senior lecturer in gender and development at Monash University and Gender and Peace, sort of the Center for Gender, Peace and Security. Samanthi's research examines the impact of development policy on employment systems, labor and livelihoods among rural women in South Asia, with particular emphasis on gender development and labor in conflict-affected areas. Key topics of her work include economic security and gender, export processing zones, employment systems, freedom of association, labor organizing, labor migration, and connections between political economy of the household and development policy. So I hope you will agree that this is a really heavyweight and exciting panel that we have today. Before I invite colleagues to present, let me just give you a little idea of this tool itself, because the purpose of today's webinar is really to find out whether it, how to implement this tool, how to work with it, what are the challenges that we face when using it, but also what it allows us to do. So I hope that this will be a frank and open discussion about the tool. So Jacqui True and I were quite concerned about how, the methodologies of trying to study social reproductive work in conditions of conflict or post-conflict or continuing spectrum of conflict that we encounter in our research. So I'm a political economist, and as is Jacqui, and our concern was that we talk about studying social reproduction, but we have very few tools. And one of the tools that we do have which is a time use survey, which feminist economists have used very successfully in many conditions, in many countries rather, that doesn't seem to be the best way of understanding social reproduction, studying social reproduction in conditions of conflict. So we developed this tool as a response to our concern, and FEOT, as we call it, a Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool, is a reflexive approach to time use, we think, that allows us to understand the time spent on paid and unpaid work, as well as to, and this is what is important, to explore what those who do this work think about it. It builds on, of course, the now well-developed methodologies of time use surveys and narrative interviews, but brings them together to study social reproduction. We suggest that time use observation by the researcher, rather than participant diaries used in time use surveys, followed by a narrative interview, is a really good way of exploring the granularity of the everyday under conditions of violence. So FEOT, what does it do? It involves a three-step process. The first step is a pre-questionnaire, and this is to avoid interfering with the participants' routine behavior during the time use observation, as well as to contextualize the participant in their environment, cultural, social, and economic. This could also help us ascertain key demographic information about the household being observed, and provides a context and enables comparability across sites. Step two is observation. And this is really important difference with the time use survey, because the time use that is recorded is done through shadowing or conducting the ethnographic observation through which the researcher does, completing a time use diary every 15 to 20 minutes for one day consisting of 12 to 16 hours. So during this day, the participant and the researcher can also take photographs, obviously with consent, as part of the observation. So it is the researcher that is doing the observation and filling in the diary rather than the participant. The third step, step three, is the post-observation narrative interview, which allows us to explore the subjective and reflective understanding of the work that is done under observation. So, for example, some of the questions that the researcher could typically ask the participant is to reflect upon various aspects of the recorded day. What made them happy, tired, angry, sad on the day, and why was this so? When were they most stressed, least stressed, etc. So it allows you to think through some of the issues of gender roles in that way. Analyzing data within the FEOT framework then allows us to do some intersectional analysis of the time use data that we record. Who benefits from it and why, analyzing observational data for the power relations at stake in how work and its benefits are allocated and distributed, with what impacts, which is for us really crucial. The second thing is the comparison of patterns of time use survey in terms of analyzing the data. So in this analytical strategy, we expect that women's unpaid care labor in households would be directly affected by proximity to conflict, and that this labor would be greater in terms of time spent on it in those households within the conflict areas. So we look at patterns across and compare these. The third is the triangulation of shadowing and time use observation with secondary data, demographic data, and of course, the narrative interview. So as our pilots in Sri Lanka and Myanmar show, an important contribution of this methodology is that it allows us to understand how participants reflect upon their work. And that's what I'm really interested to hear about today. As such, it provides us not only with data, qualitative, thick, description, reflexive, of course, all of those, but also allows us to ask different and important questions about the way in which people spend their time in spaces that they occupy, both private and public, and what they feel about their life worlds and how they make sense of them. So I would suggest that FEOT allows a space to be created where people can speak about specific moments in the day as they do social reproductive work under conditions of conflict. And that can lead us to better understand what kind of support is needed, even as we understand better how they experience depletion. Without much ado, this is just to give you a kind of a very thumbnail sketch of the tool. And also if not Jayanthi, because you're going to speak just now, if Moose can put the link to the whole document in chat, then you might be able to access it straight away. So without much ado, shall I now ask Jayanthi Lingham and Anushani to present their findings, and I will mute my mic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shirin. Melissa has put the link to the full report in the chat for those of you who haven't had the chance to read it yet. There's also a much shorter 4-page research brief which summarizes the findings. So if you go to that link, you'll find that also. So I'm going to discuss 2 key methodological findings from Sri Lanka, and I'll do that in 5 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Anushani Alagaraja from Adayalam Centre for Policy Research, and Anushani will share her analysis of some of the strengths and the limitations of the method based on our fieldwork experience in Sri Lanka. So I worked with Anushani in the directly conflict-affected site of Kilinochchi, and she also did the Tamil to English translations of the post-observation interviews for all of Sri Lanka. The 2 findings that I'm going to cover relate to, first, the structure of the FEOT, and second, its feminist dimensions. So on the structure, as Shirin's already outlined to you, the FEOT gave us a really well-defined research process to follow in the form of this 3-step method. And what we found was this was just very helpful to explain this new process to participants, because each step and the rationale behind it was very clear. And this was really important, especially important for a politically sensitive, conflict-affected context where there may be low levels of trust of strangers. So we could explain very clearly this 30-minute pre-observation meeting is to gather some basic data. The observation is to note how you'll be spending your time every 15 minutes. And in the post-observation interview, we'll ask you some questions about what we saw. And so this meant that this generated 3 clear data points, 3 clear forms of data. And that was very valuable. Actually, what I want to say is that we found that the unexpected strength of this structure came from its flexibility. And that was also what was so especially important for this context. because in a politically sensitive situation, the security situation might suddenly change, people's realities may suddenly change. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. So we were able to use the introductory meeting, not just to gather basic data about the participant in our household, but also to build rapport. So in Batticaloa, which was our proximate to conflict location in Sri Lanka in the east, our first participant lived in a lane with many of her extended family, and everyone was in and out all day. And actually, when we turned up, there were 7 chairs set out for the meeting with just a couple of us. So the plan was that everybody was going to be there. And the pre-observation meeting ended up taking, I think, over an hour. We were joined by her mother, 2 of her sisters, and their children. And what it meant was that we didn't gather all of the biodata in the end at that meeting, but that first point of contact became more than basic data collection, and it was really valuable for setting the tone for the rest of the study. And we were then able to get that any missed information about the household at the beginning of the post-observation interview. Another example of that flexibility is in Kilinochchi in the directly conflict affected site. So during the observation day with one of the women, she was suddenly called to a community meeting, a Women's Rural Village Society meeting in the afternoon. And we weren't able to accompany her to that. And so the observation day ended a few hours early. But in the post-observation interview the next day, we were able to collect that missing time use data from her. So we were able to still gather the information. And actually, I'd go a bit further and say that that moment of seeming rupture in the method when we couldn't follow it precisely because something unexpected happened was in fact particularly informative of these critical points where the conflict environment affects everyday social reproduction. So in the case of that particular participant, the reason that we couldn't join her was because it would be assumed that we were from an INGO and that she was getting disproportionate support from international donors over other people. And the area, and what this told us, what this informed us, was that the area is still so resource starved and so lacking in social infrastructure that this would actually have caused significant tensions for her and her community. And so that was really important context. That was really important information about her social reproductive realities. So that's the first point about the structure. The second point that I wanted to talk about are the feminist dimensions of the method, which Shirin had explained at the start. And what I mean by this, what was particularly notable in Sri Lanka was that the method expands the study of time use to take into account dimensions of space and violence. And this sensitivity to and our documenting of these multiple dimensions of women's everyday lives, I would say particularly resonated with some participants. And I'm just going to share a couple of quotes. So that first quote really reflects what I just said. And I think also our observing all of the unpaid household social reproductive work was validating for some participants. I would say that the participants themselves articulated their awareness of this as work. They were well aware, at least in Sri Lanka, that this is work and this is what they're doing and this takes up their time. So I wouldn't say that we were alerting them to things they didn't already know, but it was a validating experience. And there were some really interesting and useful articulations from the women about how social reproduction does create value. So this is an ongoing discussion amongst the Marxist feminists and the non-feminist Marxists. I would say that the FEOT can actually build on these feminist dimensions to become even stronger. And there are 2 aspects of that, and they both relate to, I think, our exit from the 3-step method. the first point is actually one that was brought up by one of the other researchers that I worked with, Uda Deshapriya from Law and Society Trust, who I worked with in Anuradhapura. And she brought up the fact that actually that intensity of the method that resonates with the women so strongly also potentially leaves a participant more vulnerable at the end of having carried out those 3 steps than she would be after just having done one interview. And so that's not to negate the value of having done those 3 steps, but I think we as feminist researchers just need to think more actively about what the process would be as we come out of the method. And so that would be things like follow-up phone calls, contact, and we actually individually as feminist researchers did those things, but I think that could be built systematically into the method as part of the method, and it would strengthen it. And related to that, that exit from the 3-step method is also particularly intense for the researchers, and I think this sometimes can get missed. I'm talking about obviously myself and Melissa as researchers, but I'm particularly talking about the researchers who are working in the language, so in Sri Lanka, in Tamil and in Sinhala, because there are kind of layers of their exposure to the intensity of the method. So they're not only translating for us, but they're also hearing the words and seeing everything that's happening and then translating it back again, and then experiencing our reaction, and then potentially transcribing an interview. And so I would say that a feminist ethics that we need to apply is how we are going to support researchers to do this, and whether that is through follow-up activities afterwards with them, also whether that's by setting a protocol at the beginning to understand how we can best support them. Those are things that we need to take into account. I'm just going to hand over to Anushani now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to list 2 strengths of this method and 2 challenges from my experience working in conflict-affected areas. Firstly, I found the shadowing and observing to be more useful compared to the usual in-depth interviews, even though we sometimes are able to get most information through an in-depth interview. Observing the participants throughout the day proved to be more nuanced, and it also gave us more context and understanding without having to ask further questions. For example, when we were observing one of the participants in Kalinoti, we saw that her neighbors are involved in illegal toddy making, and there were boys and men drinking toddy throughout the day and being a bit intimidating towards us. We could see how this made her very uncomfortable, and later we found out that she usually locks the door until her husband returns home, and how she waits until the men leave so she can just take a bath in the well in her house. And how she made appeal after appeal to different institutions to take care of the illegal toddy issue. We also saw the husband of one of our other participants drinking there as well. If we weren't there during that day for hours, we wouldn't have seen any of this and couldn't have made connections as to how this impacts her everyday life, her family, her mental well-being, and the community, and also the other participant who is differently able and the breadwinner of her family, while her husband daydreams. Secondly, this method allows to see the blurred lines of paid and unpaid labor of women. I think researchers tend to have firm definitions of what is paid labor and unpaid labor, and we try to put certain activities into certain boxes. But the observation sometimes suggests that there are no boxes, and it gives room for us to rethink some of these ideas and concepts. For example, 2 of the participants do home gardening. Both of them make some profit from gardening, and both of them use what they produce for their own meals as well. One of them does home gardening so she can sell vegetables and use the rest for their meals, and one of them does it for her own use and sells what is left. But she also has a separate small mushroom business. In both of these cases, by observing only, we can see how blurred or non-existent the lines are between paid and unpaid labor, and how these women understand it in their own terms. There is no break between paid and unpaid labor. For them, it's one and the same. In terms of challenges and limitations, we have to count the risk of security for the researcher and participant in every way possible, particularly in a conflict context and in areas that are highly militarized. It is important we count all possible threats and prepare to face them the best way possible. For example, to go back to the incident of illegal toddy making, the day we were there, it was so tense because around midday, someone tipped the police off about the toddy making, and there was a risk of the police coming into that area and questioning us and the men. Some of the men who were drinking there started to ask questions to the driver who was with us if we were there to find out about the illegal alcohol making. Some neighbors also started asking questions if we are from any NGO and giving aid to that particular family. These are two mild examples, but in a highly militarized area and in a community that doesn't trust outsiders fully, there needs to be a more complex, holistic security plan that includes emotional vulnerability, domestic violence, community unrest, and more. I'm hopeful that this can be done through a good risk analysis and security plans that are locally designed according to their respective context. The second limitation is there is no 100% accuracy of how a day looks for these women. I think what contributes to this the most is the culture of entertaining the visitor and prioritizing hospitality, which is amazing except for this particular research. In our experience, we've seen a participant take a certain amount of time off a usual day to make lunch for us. Saying no might be offensive in some context and affect the trust and relationship we've built, but then it affects how a usual day goes for a participant. And people also tend to hide certain aspects of their life because it is human nature. It is possible that some participants might try to buy bread or make breakfast earlier so that they don't have to make it while we are there. One participant took time to make an extra curry just for us. These are little things but make a significant change. And this challenge can be tackled when we build more trust by spending more time with them and get to the point where they don't see us as just visitors. Even then, we might not be able to get an accurate picture of a day, but when we understand these slight changes, we could raise the scale to almost accurate. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anushani. That's absolutely wonderful for both of you. And there'll be a lot to discuss and think through given your experience with FEOT. So let me now ask Melissa and Kong Yang to present their findings from Myanmar. Melissa.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful to lead on from Anu there, talking about the need to be flexible and the security issues in doing the research. And I couldn't have done it without Kong Yang and without the supportive people at Kachin Land Research Centre. I think that's an important part to note about this method because it's a faster way of entry into communities. You really need to have strong support networks and fantastic researchers on the ground, which I'm very lucky to have had in Kong Yang and her team. We did in Kachin State, we did 6 observations. So that's 6 times 12 hours or something ridiculously long like that together. And we got to know each other quite well, and we got to know the people we worked with quite well. It's not a perfect system, like Anu says. There are always issues with hospitality changing, the day changes because there are observers there, but I think we do get some good findings nonetheless, some good data nonetheless. And I think the finding I'm going to discuss is our sort of second methodological finding, which is about triangulation of data. So Jay's already talked about the flexibility of the method, which is especially important in conflict zones. But I also think that the 3-step method allows a lot of triangulation across the 3 different forms of qualitative data. And this can be very helpful in a conflict zone because you don't always get the full picture. And by having the 3 different kinds of data available, you can get a more complete, not perfect, but a more complete picture. I'm going to talk about triangulation with the example of depletion, which in the report we have a full discussion of measuring depletion in conflict and less conflict affected areas. When we're talking about depletion, we're talking about trying to measure how women became more tired, more anxious, more exhausted by social reproductive labour, that is, by the kinds of care labour they had to undertake, and the context in which they undertake it affects how tired and how anxious they get. And we could observe that at a few different points in the method. First, in the pre-observation, some depletion was quite obvious. You know, during the pre-observation interviews, when we get to know the people, you could see that women with very many care responsibilities, who had larger numbers of children, who were pregnant, or who had disabled or elderly parents, that they were often quite physically aged or drawn or thinner, and that they would mention that they were very tired in the pre-observation interview. One participant, particularly in the grey zone area of Namti, Kongyang will remember, was visibly very thin and very drawn, despite the fact she was pregnant. And she told us that she was extremely anxious because her husband had been recently jailed by the Burmese army. So we can get this data, you know, from already in the pre-observation interview, as well as all that demographic data. Then in the second step, spending time, we can measure this depletion a bit more. So the same woman in the grey zone area was frequently overwhelmed by the large numbers of children that she had in her care. This included her new husband's 3 children, so her 3 stepchildren, her 2 young boys, and that she minded her stepsister's 2 children, and that she was pregnant. And so during all of her tasks, you know, we could write down, you know, she spent this and this many hours on washing, but during all of this time, she was also monitoring the whirlwind of children that was whirling around the yard at any given moment, right? And ensuring their safety and, you know, good health and so on. So observation, in that sense, we could measure it and also triangulate with the pre-observation. I think it's important to mention, I think Kongyang might talk about this as well, that the observation allowed opportunities to hear stories, to hear stories in a little bit more unfiltered way than you might do in an interview. So we found, and I found across all 3 sites actually, that in kitchens, when we would spend time in kitchens listening to women, that they would often disclose in that kind of safer space that was their space. You know, they might disclose, you know, difficulties with their families, or you know, experiences of violence or conflict, or domestic violence. And sometimes these then weren't brought up in other settings. It was only through the observation that this kind of thing came up. So in terms of data triangulation, there are 3 steps which do make it very easy to kind of lay out to people, but each part also contained aspects of the other part. It wasn't really, you know, we have it in 3 sections, but it's not so cut and dry. You know, we could observe during the pre-observation interviews, which are supposed to be demographic only. We would hear narrative information during the observation itself, or we would get information on a daily schedule and how that changed over time in the post-observation interview. So they all contain elements of each kind of data. And in practice, these become blended, but I think that's a positive in the fact that then we can check the data against, you know, other information that we get. So in the third part, in the post-observation interview, I think in some ways, this was often best able to capture women's responses and feelings about the kind of labour they were doing, and especially about depletion. So I think I've missed my first slide. Well done. So that's the triangulation. Can you all see that? Yeah, so in the third, in the post-observation interview, we could capture ideas about tiredness, right? so one of the women, the vegetable farmer who's in the middle photo here, she said that sometimes she moans, of course it is so tiring. I sometimes moan when I'm doing all of these activities for the children and say, oh goodness, I don't even want to do anything. I'm not happy to do all of these things, but I have to do them as a woman. And that kind of reflection during the post-observation interview was reasonably common. And I do want to just add to what Jay was saying about finding 3, which is the reflexivity, which might be something of interest to our audience here today. I think that at different points in the method, the Feminist Observatory Tool allows participants to reflect a bit about their labour, especially maybe about the gender division of labour. There's participants saying, like Jay said, it's not that people don't realise that they're not doing work, it's just that it offers an opportunity for recognition, right? I have done a lot of work. I understand what I'm doing now. She has so many works, right? So I think that another good example of that we had in the south of Molimine. We had walked to the farm, to this woman's farm, and we're talking to her, the participant and her friends, while they tied up vegetables for the market. We were explaining the research to the whole group, like Jay mentioned, explaining to the friends that were there before the pre-observation interview. And her friends were so funny, joking and laughing as we chatted about men and women's work. They agreed that they were all doing a lot of work and laughed and joked about how they did so much and that men didn't really recognize it as valuable. But one friend became very serious and told the participant very directly, yes, you really need to participate in this research and help, because this is how we're going to show people how much work we women are doing. And that's really important. So, yeah, I think that opportunity for reflexivity is very important and something that came out quite a lot. But this was not a unproblematic kind of reflection either. As you see on this slide, some of it was not so straightforward. In some parts, some of the post-observation interviews, we asked women to compare their labour with the labour that their husband would do. Not that we didn't do observations of the husband's work, but we just asked women to reflect on it, having seen our tallies and our time use diaries. And some sort of mental gymnastics were required for this participant in a male-headed household about the gender division of labour. She verbalizes this dissonance between the fact that she does do longer hours, but there is an ideal that men ought to be the main workers in the household. So she notes, as you compare us, I do more work. So I think that's important to note in that reflexivity, that it's not unproblematic. So I think I'll hand over to Kong Yang, if her screen is working. Kong Yang, are you there?
Sorry. Yeah, my internet connection is poor.
So do you want to make some observations?
Yeah, okay. Okay, my name is Kong Yang, and then from Myanmar. I work with Dr. Melissa Johnston in this research in Kachin State, Myanmar. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak in this webinar. I want to talk my perspective on this new method by comparing with what I have done on normal research in our region. We normally do in-depth interview and survey, but this new method is a little bit different with what I have done. However, I like that for some reason. To say the positive view on this new method, we get more information from our participants that is important to us, even we haven't asked in interview. For instance, one of our participants from Namji, as Melissa mentioned, conflict-affected area, who talk a lot on observation there about that she is one of victims from domestic violence. Even if most people from here are so sensitive to talk about domestic violence, is sure if we just ask in normal interview, they might not answer. My observation is that kitchen is more comfortable place to talk about women's care work because we talk a lot with our participants in the kitchen. To say the negative view on this new method, I have not much, but I think it takes long hours to be with participants, and then it takes more hours than normal interview. And then my observation is it makes our participant much stressed and uncomfortable to be a long day with us. And then, yeah. And then I have to remember all the things that what they have done. For instance, I need to cook with our participant and when to collect firewood in others yet. They might be familiar with doing it, but it is strange for us to collect firewood in others yet. It makes me a kind of nervous. And then one observation is that our participant said one thing that she just recognized women's care work is also work. And then all women should know that women's care work is important and big responsibility. Yeah, that is all I have.
Thank you, Kongyang, and thanks, Melissa. I think what you have collectively, the two presentations have brought forth for us anyways, is, both as we asked you to, both what is useful about FEOT and also what are the challenges. And I'm sure that we will learn a lot from your observations and your writing about this, and also with the discussion here. So let me then, I think we have been joined by Nina Potarska now. Unless you want to go a little bit later, Nina, would you like to start and give us your observations about the presentations as well as your own understanding, because you have worked with a version of FEOT before it was FEOT, with Jacqui True in particular. So it would be great if you could discuss this with us, please. Thank you.
Sorry, I apologize for delay. Now I'm living in a village and there are often surprises here. For example, this morning my stove began smoke and whole house was in a smoke. And about observation, as I catch from the last speaker, I have some similar findings about our pilot research. And the first of all was just I feel, and we discussed with our researchers how it's different observation in the village and in the city, in the conflict line, close conflict line, and in the normal cities which were affected by conflict. And especially it's some maybe it's not worries, but feelings which we have to discuss after research, because after observation we had a common call with all, because we are using this approach every time. It's because we want to low down emotional level after research, after this observation, because some of them was really hard to, and especially women not recognize their care work. And it's always was on the first step when they ask, oh, maybe it's it's not so interesting because I'm not working, I'm doing nothing, but we know that this woman has a small child below 6 years. It's never can be I don't know, not working. And of course the third step was about how we count this work and how this woman recognize this work after this. So I think this field research was in a two steps. One step, it's our information which we want to collect to count this care work, because for us, like a researcher in the field work, it's always difficult to count this care work. And I think this methodology, it's interesting to how we can use this. And the second step, it's how we can work with this thinking and feeling of this woman, which we observe, to recognize their work, care work. And after this third step discussion, they looked on this care work in different way. And of course they start thinking, and one woman starts even crying because she understands that there are no space for her needs, because after after a whole day she has just maybe 15 minutes to her needs. It's one couple of minutes, it's smoking together with other mothers after school, and another her own space, it's another smoking when she I don't know best to sleep her baby. And it's just maybe 10-15 minutes per day. And it's, I don't know, maybe we can also use this more maybe in a other, because I like to collect information, and I really really became sad when we not use this because after during this third step I'm recorder interview, and there are a lot of interesting findings and quotation from this woman, how they was before and after, how they looking on this care work before and after. And maybe I like interviews, and I have many different research which we put this quotation, because this quotation make text more touchable maybe, and for others, and maybe other women can compare their experience with the experience of this woman. And maybe we need to add this interview with this comparison between experience before and after with the quotation. So I'm really late, and I don't maybe clearly understand what you expect in my speech. And
oh no, Nina, this is great, because this also gives us a different approach to, and as you said, this was a kind of a pilot that you did before Jayanthi and Mel were in the field and with Jacqui. So it's really valuable, your comments.
But yes, I want to maybe make more widely my first thesis about the psychological help, because we provide this help among our research group. to make to each other like empathy listening, because after some observation, not all, it was really difficult, because for example, in my case, because my observation was on Avdiivka, it's a close to conflict line. In many times and many years, this city was under the shelling, and now they always expect something like this. But after half a year, we have ceasefire, but nobody knows how it can work in future. And for example, yes, it was very difficult to even was in this atmosphere, because sometimes and after 1 week you can feel like more comfortable in this. But I remember first time I was really scary because of the shelling, not in this city but very close. And I understand that people in this house were nervous because of this, not because of themselves, much more about me, because they was thinking that I was scary after this shelling.
Wow.
And we discussed a lot about this. So it's take a lot of time in our day, this discussion. And other thing, it was how this the other woman from this city, she has even special space for children and here when they are hiding during the shelling. And in this place, the mother read the fairy tales for her children, because she want to switch their focus from this shelling. And after that, I was a bit affected of this new information, and we have maybe few hours of this. So I think this maybe for researcher we need some track of the care and self-care discussion, or I don't know, some help, or I don't know, maybe not psychological help like a therapist or something else, but we need discuss this experience, not to have this for a long time or conserve this for a long time.
Thank you, Nina. I think that has been already raised as well by Melissa and Jayanthi. But yes, that's really important for us. So thank you so much for your comments. I just wanted to say to the attendees, please do write your comments, questions, either in Q&A. I think Q&A would be fine, or if you feel sort of easier with chat, that's also okay, so that we can go straight from the discussants' remarks to Q&A. So now let me ask Dr. Ratna Sudarshan to give her comments. Thanks, Ratna.
Thank you, Shirin. Thanks very much for inviting me to this discussion. It's been really interesting. And just, just building on what people have been saying, a couple of you said that, people's workday is a little different when they're being shadowed and observed. But it struck me that there may be questions we could ask where that doesn't really matter all that much. So what I wanted to do is just give some examples of questions that I'm currently, sort of working on or thinking about, and see, I wanted to see whether using this tool could potentially be useful or not, and, just share those reflections with you. So certainly, so this is of course moving away from conflict situations. And just to make it very, to make it more concrete, I wanted to take a particular issue that around which a lot of research is currently going on in India. And that's about the level of women's workforce participation and the fact that over the last 15 years, it appears to have been, I mean, according to the national data, it appears it has been steadily declining. So the question is, the context is one, that there's a huge gap in labor force participation of men and women, and that's nothing new, that's always been the case. And the second is that over the last 15 years, the level of women's workforce participation is going down even more. Now, obviously, a lot of the research that's being done is quantitative in nature, and it is, because we're trying to measure levels, measure trends, and do it in such a way that it can be compared with previous surveys and data. But there are a lot of complementary questions around this. For example, if this reduction in labor forces, in participation is true for all kinds of women and all kinds of situations. So firstly, there's no answer that would be, which would be correct for all segments. So we really have to look at different segments. There are women who would have dropped out of work. Can we identify what might have been the sort of triggers for this, for women either to drop out of work or change the nature of their work commitment, and it's very likely to be linked to issues of social reproduction and care. But we need to understand at what point does it become, does it actually require a change in their lives? So what is it about the everyday, in a sense, that leads to the outcomes that the data is showing? And can we use this tool to potentially answer some of these questions? So it would not be a macro response, it would not be true for the whole country, but maybe for certain segments. So one example, now if you're proposing a new tool, I mean, there are two ways of, two things that would make it useful. One is where if it can offer us new insights to old questions. The other, of course, is if this description actually leads to new issues emerging or new ideas emerging. So what I'm really going to talk about is old questions and the insights we could get, but possibly if, I'm sure you'd also have new insights to offer from the use of the tool. So for example, one thing which we can actually get a sense of through interviews is that, and yes, I should say here that a lot of what I'm going to say here is based on some research I'm currently doing with Mala Khullar. It's research in progress, and just using this as a way to discuss the idea. So one is when you look at some women who have changed their jobs, right? So a number of them were in full-time regular corporate sector work. Some have completely stopped working. Others have moved to consulting or to home-based business. Now, one of the things that a time use observation could bring out, for instance, is the way in which different activities have to be performed over the day. And it doesn't matter if you're talking to someone, if you're changing a little bit the details of what you do, but the broad, the major things that need to be done in the course of the day will need to be done anyway. And so basically what I'm getting at is that many women find it difficult to clear a stretch of time of more than 3 hours or 4 hours because of the things that need to be done. Now, the significance of this is that if that is the case, and if we say that this cannot change, in the near future, then we could advocate for types of work that actually, match the availability of time. And regular part-time work is not really available barring a few exceptions, we don't really have that in India. So if we could, so now it's not that we don't know this, we know this, and time use data tells us, can also give us maybe, but it hasn't quite been analyzed in this way. But the observation in the interviews also add to the texture of the, of the information that we're providing. So this was one thing that struck me. A similar thing is what happens to older children. So a lot of our focus is on very young children or on the elderly when we talk about care, but it's not like children in school can just be left to themselves. And so what is the nature of the care that they need? What is the nature of the institutional arrangements, if any? What are the, security situations that require or, lead women to feel that they need to be around? So these are in a sense, examples from educated middle class women's lives. It's not that the same questions would also arise for, any group of women possibly, but I'm just speaking from that context. Similarly, there are some situations where maybe women would not mind being shadowed and making their lives public. For example, we spoke to one woman who's a mother of a child with disability, who actually felt that her experience was one from which others in the same situation, I mean, that she was in a position to help, and she's trying to do that in various ways. So things that where we actually want a policy response, and all we're trying to do is make the case sharper and clearer. So it's not a new question. It's not something where we don't have any knowledge of what the situation is, but possibly a carefully crafted study could make the point more sharply. So that's one thing that struck me. One thing which I felt it wasn't clear to me how this tool could help, and is that some of the women who moved, for example, into consulting or even home-based business, what is interesting is that they would then be interspersing days of very, very intense activity with days when there isn't, when they have more time. So the manner of dealing with depletion, which is obviously one of the main reasons why they chose to drop out of the regular full-time work, was not was to have this sort of distributed over time. So a one-time snapshot would not give us this understanding. But so it seems to be fine that you can take a week of very intense work, you have enough support for that, but then you need 2 weeks when you can, I mean, have things at a different pace. So this is something that I thought was a very interesting insight into how women deal with depletion, but it's not clear to me whether this tool could contribute something. So that's a question to all of you. And finally, I just want to make a small comment on, on the everyday itself. I mean, I found these, this conceptualization of the everyday and the interaction of space-time violence, I find it extremely appealing, and, it gives a nice framework. But to what extent can we take the everyday as something that's going to stay? I mean, there's a lot of push for change in the everyday, right? So it's in a process of continuous change. And even if you're looking at women's care responsibilities, there's constant change that comes from external factors such as education, new job opportunities, or totally unanticipated events like the COVID-19 hitting you. So there's continuous change. So to what extent will description at a point in time also help us to understand the processes of change that are necessarily happening? And, as a specific example, we know from, research all over the country, different situations, that women, children, daughters of women in informal work, I mean, this is true of daughters everywhere, but particularly this group, they most certainly do not want to go into the kind of work that their mothers are doing. In other words, they definitely want their everyday lives to be very, very different. So if we're looking at aspirations for change, I mean, how could the tool help us to understand not just the present everyday, which is useful for a set of purposes and a set of policy responses, but also change over time. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow, fantastic sort of comments, Ratna. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll come back to several of the points that you have raised later. But can I now ask Samanthi Gunawardana to give her comments and also maybe some reflections on the whole. Thanks, Samanthi.
Thanks, Shirin, and thank you very much for inviting me, everyone, to comment on this wonderful project and the emergence of this new tool. I'm going to make some very brief comments and observations about my own perspectives about the tool, and then I'll move on to responding and summarising what some of the participants have said so far. So I'll start by saying that time is, of course, one of the taken for granted banal aspects of everyday life. We measure it in its passing, but time is an important area of study for feminist scholars because the temporal allocation of labour in social reproduction matters. It matters because women's labour and labour tasks that are characterised as feminised, for example, childcare, have been devalued or completely erased from public record. And despite the time that's taken on those tasks, their labour is significantly devalued. Time is, after all, articulated within systems of value, including production and social reproduction, and so capturing time use is really important. The Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool enables its users and participants in the study to not only understand how time is allocated to various tasks, but I think it also enables us to map the gendered and the generational division of labour in the household. I know that Jay and Mel have mentioned that they didn't necessarily interview men, but through the observational tool, you can actually make observations about who is doing common reproductive tasks in the household. And the other thing that we can do using this tool is to observe and see how different generations of women or girls and boys and men in the household also perform different social reproductive tasks in the household. And I think the report that came out of this study actually does touch upon how sometimes younger girls or the elder daughters in families may take on some of the responsibility in the household. I think what's really interesting and important, and one of the major contributions of this tool, is that it enables us to understand the participants' view of their own time use and how they make sense of that allocation. And this is something that has been touched upon over and over again by all of the participants in this panel. From a technical point of view, it really does help to bring data to life. So rather than looking at a quantified number in a table of time use, in a larger time use survey, what we can generate through this tool and what we see is that women's voices can really be heard. And importantly, I think this is an area that hasn't been explored, perhaps not in this presentation at least, it may be explored in some of the publications, is that this methodology can help us to understand how the temporalities of social reproduction are relational, how they're negotiated, and how participants may navigate gendered temporal divides in everyday life. I have so many questions for the researchers that were involved in this study, because I really want to understand how, for example, the women that they were observing and participating with, how they engaged in everyday negotiations or everyday bargains over who does what in the household. Perhaps those routines were set, but perhaps there was a degree of negotiation. Perhaps there was an importance of mobilizing different social relationships within their households, but also in their communities, in order to engage and perform the social reproductive labor that enabled their lives and the lives of their families to function. And I think this leads to a really important point, and again, it's touched on time and time again by all of the panelists, is that this includes this tool helps us to observe and collectively reflect on the forms of agency that may still be present within the everyday life of the household in this case. So what are the minutiae of the decisions that women make on a daily basis about how and when and where they perform their social reproductive labour? Where are the spaces and possibilities for agency, and where are the remaining oppressions or restrictions on those decision-making choices that they have? I also want to make a point about practice. There may be people who are development practitioners, or they're practitioners in the peace and security space. And I think as a tool, and as a number of the participants have noted, the structure that is given to you in this tool is actually really helpful. It helps you to generate that comparable data. It can be applied, I think, across multiple contexts, but we need to pay attention, of course, to the nuances of each of those contexts. But the structure itself, as several of the participants have noted, can give rise to flexibility. It's also useful because often in practice, whether you're a peace and security practitioner or you are a development practitioner, you need to often complete research work in a short amount of time. And I think this tool gives you an opportunity to do that, but do it in a way that is really rigorous, that isn't necessarily just a quick and dirty, field interview, you're in and you're out within a couple of hours. What this tool really does is it gives you that opportunity to engage with the participants properly, to understand the contours of their lives and their communities and their households, understand the nuances of conflict if there is conflict at that particular moment, and also some of the other important aspects that the researchers have highlighted. For example, understanding what is happening in the neighbour's house when there's a toddy. Toddy, for those of you who don't know, is like a type of a moonshine in Sri Lanka, and it's kind of illegal. So you're not really meant to do that kind of stuff. But that stuff, those kind of activities in the immediate vicinity of women's everyday lives also generates forms of violence. And this tool enables us to really kind of understand and observe that. I think one of the greatest strengths of the Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool is that it does enable the participant to reflect on their own time use, and it provides a way of articulating the value of their own labour. And as we've heard from our researchers, women are acutely aware of their everyday social reproductive labour, because as the women in this study note, they feel the effects of the labour intimately on their bodies, their minds, and their spirit. And so perhaps participating in this study, in a study using this tool, engaging with the researcher, reflecting on their experience, does provide an avenue for validating their experience, as in the case of Sri Lanka and Myanmar, or it gives you an awareness of your life, awareness of what is happening, and an awareness of the value of the labour that you do, as was stated in the Ukrainian example. So I think one of the powerful aspects of this tool is that it can be empowering in the sense that it offers recognition and validation of how women perceive the value of their own labour. I think, though, that it's also can be disempowering. And I think it was both Mel and Melissa touched on that. And I think also, I think everyone really touched on that point, which is after you've completed this research, you kind of leave the field and you leave the participants of the study with this newfound awareness, but we're not sure where that awareness is going to take the participants. So that's something I think we can think of collectively, and I think the people in the audience may also have some reflections on that. So they're the main comments that I wanted to make, but I also want to reflect on and summarise the key points that our researchers have raised. So the first thing is, I think that there is a lot of congruity between some of the observations that I've already made and what the researchers have also found to be the strengths of the process and of the methodology. One is that the structure is easy to explain. It does help with rapport building because you're engaging in this three-step process. It allows the researcher to understand the context of the environment in which the woman is located. And I think that's really important, particularly for conflict affected or violence affected contexts in particular. I think everyone has pointed to the fact that the three-step process enables you to generate rich data. You're not just generating a single observation or a single quantified table, if you will. You're actually trying to get the participants, understanding and meaning of their own labour and of their own work as they go about their daily lives. I thought it was really fascinating that everyone mentioned that research was able to occur in a safe space, usually a kitchen. And I think that's actually a really wonderful recognition that the kitchen, which is a source of it's a place where a lot of unpaid labour occurs. It can be a space where, or a site of depletion, but it is also a woman's own space as defined by the gender norms of that particular society. And as it is her own space, it's also a safe space. And this is where the methodology can provide for greater access and nuance in understanding women's understanding of their own safe spaces where they feel empowered to speak and so on. So that information can also feed into the findings of your work. Sorry, did someone interrupt?
Sorry, it was just me saying that would you like to wrap up, please?
Yes. I think one of the key drawbacks, well, not drawbacks, but something that we can think about collectively and improve upon is the safety of the researchers and the participants, both the psychosocial safety, but also in some cases, particularly in conflict or violence affected contexts, the physical safety as well. And we can talk about that collectively. Thank you.
Those were fabulous comments, Sam. I'm so sorry to sort of have to interrupt, but I just think that the richness of the discussion, we want to take it out to our attendees who have been waiting rather patiently. I've got Yasmin, who put up her hand, and if she's still there, would you like to ask your question, Yasmin? I think she is left. Okay, so I've got some, and Fiorella, would you like to say a few words about what you have been doing? And we've been chatting on this question and answer. And then Modesta, can you ask the question, can you speak more on the notion of depletion? How shall we do this? Fiorella, do you want to say something just now? Am I being heard there or not? I don't know what's happening. I'll write to Fiorella here. Please speak.
Hello, I think I've been unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Oh, I see. Everybody in the, so we need to unmute you before you can speak. All right.
So thank you so much for this webinar. It's really, really fascinating and so rich in terms of methods and the type of data that mixed methods can really contribute to a political economy analysis. I just wanted to flag an initiative that we have developed and piloted in 3 different countries: Ghana, India, and Nepal. And now we have scaled up in a GCRF project led by Royal Holloway University with Catherine Bricknell, where we actually are looking at the theme of depletion through a lens of social reproduction in the climate crisis, credit and nutrition nexus. So how the climate crisis and tools for climate resilience, such as financial inclusion, actually come at the cost of women's bodily depletion. And we are looking at depletion in a 360 angle. So we're looking at the psychological depletion, but we're actually putting a little bit more kind of a lens to look at the bodily depletion through nutritional outcomes, and also work not only in terms of time burdens, but also in terms of physical activity of social reproductive activities and productive activities. And by triangulating all this source of data, we're hoping to get a really rich type of analysis and evidence on how the processes of social reproduction, together with the political economy of analysis through social inclusion, financial inclusion policies, and the retraction of state welfare systems, can really create a compounding crisis in this context. And we are looking particularly at the context of Cambodia and Tamil Nadu. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, I think there's a lot to work together on, and it would be wonderful to do so. I also have some questions from Mohammed. Mohammed asked, how can we quantify women's unpaid work? In statistics, economy is all about paid work, and therefore more of men's work. And also whether we can use FEOT, which is really important question, in non-conflict zones, especially in Pakistan, or anywhere really, I think, Mohammed. But would you like to say a bit more about that? Is Mohammed being unmuted, Muzan?
He's not there anymore.
Oh, if his hand is still up and I can see him there, but okay.
Oh,
So I did text him the answers. So
he needs to unmute, please.
Mohammed, you need to unmute. I don't know what's going on there.
Okay, can you hear me?
Oh yes, now we can. Thank you, Mohammed.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for such a wonderful presentation from all the experts. And okay, let me just tell you, I'm a PhD scholar in University of Science Malaysia. So my interest is in women unpaid work and their layer experience in rural Pakistan. So I was just seeing that this methodology, new methodologies regarding what every day this observatory tool, I'm already developed some tools for my own research. Maybe it will be better for all of us if we can go through this intersectionality and this with the different segment of the society. I'm really hopeful that my own work, it's not on the I mean, it's just a small level in a village. It's some qualitative work, but hopefully I will see what I can get from this daily observatory tool to get into my own study and with focus with this, especially in the layer. I mean, how the layer experience and unpaid work, they are interconnected to each other, and how the women can get layer even from their own work, because they don't have enough time to be in the public space or doing the layers. So it will be great. I will look up into this tool with the focus, and I will definitely look for your support and help, and everyone, if anyone can contribute in my own study or guide me in this, and I will look for next Warwick this webinar. I'm very keen to be with you people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that somebody is sort of not being able to unmute. I'm really sorry. Muzan is trying her level best. But in the meantime, maybe I can ask Jayanthi and Anu and Melissa and Kong Yang to sort of have, tell us what their responses to these comments of the discussants and the questions are, because I think we are also running out of time, which is always a good sign, really, because you want to stay longer than you can. So Jayanthi, do you want to make a start? And Anu?
Jayanthi, you need to unmute.
I did. Sorry, it doesn't let it. I think there's no order of it, but it's working now. I guess because there are a few others who maybe want to chip in, I'll very briefly. I just very briefly wanted to pick up on the questions about how do we quantify what's depletion, or how do we quantify women's work. And Fiorella, it's so great to have you here, because I don't know if it's a coincidence, but somebody forwarded myself and Shirin your latest publication, your World Development publication, just yesterday, and I was discussing it. We were discussing it on email, and I think there are two things. The first thing is that quantification through, for example, with Fiorella's study, they're measuring actual energy spent on work through technical tools is really, really valuable, and the time use also contributes to the quantification. But there are certain things that, in my view, you just can't quantify. And to me, that you can't quantify with the tools that we currently have. And to me, that says something about the problems with the tools, that, you know, the fact that only certain work counts as paid work and therefore can be quantified within that realm. The fact that, you know, you can do some care work, for example, and you're not spending a lot of energy because you're sitting, say, next to somebody who you're caring for, or you're standing very still, so you're physically not spending energy, but you're absolutely physically and emotionally exhausted. And therefore, for me, that is where the value of the depletion lens comes into its own. And so I really think there's potential to combine the two, perhaps in a mixed method approach. But I would really kind of challenge the attendees, as we have been challenged through doing the study, to think about the limitations of those structures that are telling us we have to quantify things in order to value them. Because I think this study brought out so many of those dimensions that showed that things matter in the everyday, that you just can't fit into those categories. I'll stop now because I could carry on a bit more, but I think there are others to say things.
Yeah, I'd pick that up. And I would also say that there is great interest in the measurement of women's unpaid labour. And although the tools are not at all perfect, and that's why we're working on this one, there have been, you know, big time use studies. It's now sort of part of the UK Women's Budget Group and efforts to kind of quantify. And one way you do quantify it is just to count the time. So it's not like it can't be quantified, because time can be quantified. But what our study does is go a lot further to show the effects, like the depletion effects, to show the context in which that happens, and the meaning that it has for the participants in that unpaid labour. And I'd like to pick up something Ratna talked about, actually, with the you know, trying to move this across to non-conflict contexts and how we can operationalise it in other everyday contexts, which is also Mohammed's question. So I think that, you know, to the question about, can the study be used to identify triggers when women, you know, drop out of the workforce or can't be in the workforce? In conflict context, that was sometimes very apparent and very easy to identify in the survey, because you know, their land had been taken. So I imagine for some context, the crisis point, you know, this time use survey can be used to identify what crises push people to then not be in the labor market, you know, or to stop engaging in subsistence work and that kind of thing. So I think the key to that might be to look at the crisis points for labor. And I agree on the flexible and ongoing part-time work being a good way to kind of come at this in a lot of contexts. To your question about how we would measure it in, you know, when there's periods of high intensity and low intensity, I know a few academic women friends of mine try and do a 5-day work week over 3 days so that they can try and balance their care responsibilities. And, you know, because it takes such a long time to do a 12-hour observation or 16-hour observation, we had anyway discussed that doing shifts of observation might be a way around it, you know, do a morning shift and then an afternoon shift at a different point in time. And I feel like that could be a way that you would be able to capture both low intensity and high intensity work days, you know, one adaptability of it. So, and to the question, how will a snapshot help us understand change over time? This is not a perfect method to understand that at all, or it would be very expensive to do so because you'd have to do it a few different times, which could be work. But in the post-observation interview, that's really what we tried to get off in the initial stages by asking, so how was this day different from any other usual day? How was this different before the conflict, after the conflict? What prompted this change? So you at least have some sort of reflective or narrative story about how things change over time, which is not perfect, but it does give some clarity. And I think I'll stop there on my response.
Thanks, Melissa. Kongyang, do you have any further sort of thoughts that you'd like to share?
Maybe
okay.
She can't unmute.
Yeah.
We're having a problem with the
I
mute button.
We
Sorry,
are,
guys.
Kind of running out of time anyway. Sorry, Jayanthi, did you have?
I just wondered whether Anushani wanted to share anything.
No, I already checked with her.
Sorry.
Yes, don't worry, I wasn't discriminating.
There's so many of us.
So yeah, but I think that what it does tell me, and Jacqui has been here with a very bad cold and a headache throughout. I think, Jacqui, you'd agree that what this discussion has shown is that there is a lot of potential in terms of developing further through these insights, both of Jayanthi, Mel, and Anushani, and Kong Yang, having done this work, and also of Nina with doing the pilot with you, but also the discussion, the kind of work, for example, Ratna is doing now, which is not about conflict necessarily, but conflicts of different kinds, right? I was also struck by the distinction that was sort of made between rural and urban settings, right? And the kind of different challenges that might be there. And then, of course, Samanthi's very important point about sort of generational divisions of labor rather than just looking at sort of, and I do think that there is something powerful about the concept of the everyday, which allows us to observe differently. Because it is about sort of, like if somebody has to walk rather than drive, it has an effect on their everyday, but also has an effect on them, right? So, or if they are walking in a condition of conflict rather than in a park taking their leisure exercise, and which is, of course, we are desperate to do now as we go into lockdown, which is all we are allowed to do. So, so I think that sort of bringing together space, time, and violence in a way allows us to sort of open up some new questions, but also, as Ratna says, sort of, put a new lens on old questions. And so that was really helpful for me to understand. The second thing I would say is the question is, of course, for us about how do you scale up, right? And the critical question is, how do you respect the time and space of both the participant, but also the risk that researchers take? And I think there's a lot to discuss there. But what I'd like to sort of, I hope, is that through our future work in this and our future discussions, we would continue to have a conversation about this and hopefully refine the tool itself, but more importantly, have a better understanding of social reproduction, its costs as depletion, but also the agency, as Samanthi said, that women exercise in different ways. So thank you ever so much. It's been fantastic, sort of, particularly, of course, I'd like to thank Jayanthi, Anu, Melissa, and Kong Yang for their presentation, as always, wonderful. Thanks also to our discussants, to Nina, to Ratna, and Samanthi, and Samanthi in particular for standing in for and doing a double job, and then me having to interrupt. So sorry about that, but thanks for that. And we hope that you will sign up to get WICED's newsletters and engage with GPS where you would like to. And also just to say that actually, and I didn't say that, but at the start, but that this project was really funded by the two universities coming together. So Monash-Warwick Alliance funded this project, and we are thankful to them. But also I'd like to finally thank Mazayan, sort of Khalil, who is been fantastic behind the scenes organizing it, and to Maeve, Maeve Monahan, who's our administrator, who must be in mourning today if things go really bad in the US elections. But thank you all. So thank you and goodbye till next time.